As for today's event, which is on the subject of climate risk insurance and a specific, I guess, organization called the Africa Risk Capacity, or ARC. That's the subject today, and it's going to be described to us in some of their activities by our colleagues here, Erica Hovani, excuse me, and her colleague Ekhosuehi Iyahen. Did I get that close? Okay, close enough. Okay. So as I say, we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. I think Erica will reiterate this, but feel free to ask questions at any time if you're in the room, and obviously if you're not in the room, then type them in and we'll relay them. And here we go. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So for those of you who just came in, if you want to kind of move into the center here, and really ask questions whenever they occur to you. Don't wait until the end, so we can address them as we're talking. So Ekhosuehi and I are from the Africa Risk Capacity, which is we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about what ARC does generally, and then also a new initiative that we have that's under development called the Extreme Climate Index. So ARC was founded in 2012 when a group of African governments got together and decided they wanted to establish their own entity to help them better plan and respond to natural disasters and extreme weather events. We do that by bringing together three different components. Early warning. That's okay. Oh, okay, sorry. We do that in three ways. Actually, maybe I'll stand up, that'll be better. Platform, which is called Africa RiskView. And we use Africa RiskView, the countries have. Africa RiskView helps countries to monitor and understand their the evolution of their seasons, so they can look at their.
Sorry, it's out for the webinar participants, so we'll just have you use that one.
Okay. Third try. So Africa RiskView helps the countries to monitor their weather risk and their food vulnerability over this course of the seasons. We combine this with operations and contingency planning. We work with countries to help them develop contingency plans and operations plans that will help them plan for what they will do in the event of a natural disaster, extreme weather event. Once we've worked with countries to help them understand how to use Africa RiskView and how to understand their weather risk, and also they have submitted contingency plans to us that are approved by our board, then we combine this with insurance. So we have our separate insurance company, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that transfers risk to the market for our member states. So ARC is actually made up of two different organizations. ARC Agency, which does the government interactions, the government level interactions, where we work with them to understand their weather risk, to customize Africa RiskView, which is our software platform, to develop contingency plans, and that operates with the support of the World Food Program. But we also have an insurance company, which is our own insurance company. It operates under the laws of Bermuda, just like any other insurance company. But what's unique about it is that the member states that take out insurance from ARC are also the owners of ARC. So when they take out insurance, they become a member owner because ARC is a mutual insurance company. So the members are the countries, African governments that have taken out insurance, along with DFID and KFW, which provide the underlying seed capital for the insurance company. So any insurance company, normally, has to have capital underlying. Our countries pay premiums, economically sustainable premiums, but that first layer of capital is provided on a 20-year returnable basis by KFW and DFID. So ARC Agency and ARC Limited work together to help our member states to respond to natural disasters more effectively and quickly on their own. Oops. Am I not moving forward here? There we go. Oops, sorry. Okay, excellent, thanks. So this is a graphic of the issues that we're trying to address here. So A is a typical picture of typical household coping mechanisms. So when the rains fail, the first thing that a household would do would be to start eating less preferred food and look for work. So they know that the rains have failed even before the harvest happens. They know that the harvest is going to be a bad one, and so they start engaging in negative coping mechanisms. From the time of the harvest to about the first 3 months, then they start using their savings, borrowing, and selling non-productive assets. In the 3 to 5 month period, they'll start eating less, and then after month 5, they'll start selling off their productive assets. Under the current emergency response paradigm, the rains fail, and humanitarian agencies work to respond as quickly as possible, but they don't always have the funding that makes it necessary to do that. There'll be an assessment period, then an appeal, and then funding. So if we use the response in the Sahel in 2014-2015 as an example, the rains failed in late 2014, and the UN appeal was launched in mid-February of 2015, and then it takes the time to fund the appeal going forward. What we try to do in ARC is when the rains fail, the countries, because they're using Africa RiskView and they have developed this model, work together with us to customize it for their risk on the ground. We work with them to model the estimated impact of the drought on their populations right away, immediately. We don't have to wait for an assessment or anything else, because the insurance is parametric and it's done on basis of objective triggers. So when we look at the model, and they're looking at it too because they have it also, we see that a drought is likely, we can go to the country and ask them to submit their final implementation plan. As I said, we develop operations plans with them. That's a prerequisite to taking out the insurance. At this point, when a payout is likely, they have to do a final implementation plan that is specific to their particular event. So the first operations plan would have been general. What would they do in a drought situation generally? This would be specific to their particular situation on the ground, and if they can, when we know and they know that a drought is likely, they can do that ahead of time, and ARC Limited can make an insurance payout within 10 to 14 days of the end of the season. And the idea here is that then the country uses its insurance payout that it paid for to fund its own program that it designed to respond to its population quickly, effectively, more economically than it would than waiting for the appeal. Before we started ARC, we did a cost-benefit analysis. Oxford University actually, on our behalf, did a cost-benefit analysis that found that $1 using this system can save $4.40 using the traditional appeal system, because you're preventing harm rather than responding once something has already happened. As I said, in the 2014-15 Sahel situation, the appeal, the UN appeal, was launched in mid-February 2015. We paid out to Senegal and Niger, 2 of our member states who were insured. We also were insuring, Senegal, Niger, and Mauritania. We paid out to them in January. So they had gotten the money before the appeal was even launched. But our member states are taking out typically less than $30 million worth of insurance. So this insurance cash injection that they're getting isn't sufficient to pay for all of the needs to respond to the drought. What it does, it allows them to respond quickly through their own systems. But there's still, this doesn't negate the need for a further humanitarian appeal to cover the rest of the, and again, on the orders of magnitude, the Sahel appeal in 2015 was for nearly $2 billion for 9 countries. We were only insuring 3, we paid out $26 million. So there's still a significant needs there, but this just allows the country to respond quickly, helps them to protect development gains, helps them to, it reduces mobility fewer people leaving their communities looking for other work, and fewer people engaging in negative coping mechanisms that might not be easily reversed. So all of this is premised on Africa RiskView, which is our our software program. It takes satellite rainfall data that's on about a 10-kilometer square basis, updated every 10 days, puts it on top of information about crops or pasture lands, what people are growing, what kind of vulnerable populations they have, who's at risk, to what extent they're dependent on agriculture. And this can be customized by the country. So the country makes decisions about how they want, who they want to consider to be vulnerable to different situations, how they want to count that. Because again, they're paying for this, so there's a, they have to balance what they want their total response to be with what they are going to wind up paying in a premium. We take the information about who's at risk and what's happening agriculturally on the ground and put that on top of response costs. The countries give us a per person, or come up with on their own, the per person response cost that we use combined with the number of people total to understand what the cost would be of responding to various events. So the countries have Africa RiskView. All of the member states have Africa RiskView, whether they take out insurance or not. Once they've worked with us to customize Africa RiskView and understand the parameters, that customization that they've selected is locked to the insurance contract that they get. But they can use this throughout the season to look in nearly real time and see how their agricultural seasons are progressing. This makes their participation in the insurance scheme completely transparent to them because they're the ones who came up with the parameters and they can monitor it on an ongoing basis. Right now, I keep talking about drought because that's the product that we have so far, but we're also working on a flood product, which is in a pilot stage right now, and tropical cyclone. So all of this is based, the pricing of the insurance and the understanding of the country's risk is based on a historical profile. So we have, in all cases, at least 30 years of data for the countries, in some cases much more. So this is the ARV Drought Index for Niger from 1901 to 2013. And you can see that there is a period of drying in around 1970. I don't know if you can see that, from 1970 to early 80s. There are a bunch of more severe events. And this is important. Obviously, ARC didn't exist then. It only existed in 2012. But it's important to look at the way that this kind of drying trend impacts the insurance that countries take out. Oh, it's the drought index. So it's actually, there should be a number there, but it's the rainfall. Yeah. So this looks at the same data, but I wish I had the pointer. In terms of response costs, and you can see that there's a cluster in the early 70s and then one in the early 80s of more severe and more frequent droughts. Now, in the Sahel, there were famines in the 60s and 80s that resulted in hundreds of thousands of people being dependent on food aid. And you can see also, for our purposes, one of the most important things is if you look at this line, the blue one at the bottom, that is the 1 in 5 year return period, which means that's about the level of events you would expect to see in Niger every 5 years. And the dotted line is every 10 years. But you see with the more frequent and more severe events, this couple of patterns here, that by the time you get to the mid-80s, what used to be a 1 in 10 year event, what used to be a 1 in 10 year event is now a 1 in 5 year event. At the same time, or as a result of that, the cost of insurance for those countries would go way up. So you can see it's more than 25% the premium estimate by the mid-90s because it trails a little bit. Right. Now our countries, ARC's member countries, are, not all of them, but a lot of them, among the least developed countries. They can't afford to keep paying this level of premium as premiums go up, as events become more volatile, more extreme, more frequent, and this puts into jeopardy the risk management system that we're working on, because it makes it so that countries can't afford the same level of coverage that they had before, and makes it harder for them to sustain it in the long run, which is why we started to develop the Extreme Climate Index, which is going to help our member states not just respond to their weather risk, manage their weather risk, but actually manage their climate risk.
Thanks, Erica. I will sit. So, as Erica mentioned, we've been doing quite a bit of work with governments on the continent in terms of how do you manage your weather risks. And one point that I wanted to actually address was this mechanism is actually quite important, because when you look at the issue of risk management, say from a Ministry of Finance perspective, and you bring the issue of, okay, how do you manage natural disaster risk to a Ministry of Finance? It's really important that they have numbers to put to these events and also to have access to these tools. One of the critical, I think, benefits of the payouts that we had in the Sahel was, yes, the payouts were made in January, but before that, a Ministry of Finance has visibility in terms of funding that's coming into the country. So that means that they can proactively begin to look at how do we implement response, even before the funds come into the country, because of that visibility in funding. And I think that that's also an important thing to keep in mind when we think about how governments look to manage risk, and especially from a financial perspective, not just from in other ways as well, which are also equally important. But as Erica mentioned, can I get the clicker? This is a real challenge for us in terms of how do we ensure that the product that we're offering to our governments is actually a sustainable product. Climate change poses a real threat towards that in terms of unsustainable costs associated with this. And so one of the things that we have been looking to develop is what we call an extreme climate facility. So how can we use the same infrastructure that we have developed in our countries to link early warning systems with contingency plans and financing, so that governments can respond? But can we do a similar thing, develop some kind of mechanism or some kind of tool that can allow us to track changes in extreme events and link that to financing, which we can use for adaptation? One of the issues that our governments have raised is we understand how ARC works in terms of responding on a year-to-year basis with disasters, but it's really difficult to access funding for adaptation. What can you do as an institution on that front? And so we've been working to say, okay, can we develop an extreme climate index that will allow us to actually track potential changes that are occurring and link that with financing mechanisms? Can we do that in a way that we have an objective, data-driven index rather than having a subjective sort of assessment of tracking shifts in frequency and intensity of these extreme weather events? Another idea that we've also been exploring is within the international climate negotiation process, there's a lot of discussion about, okay, making adaptation finance available. But the quantum of need is really significant. And what are the vehicles, innovative vehicles that developed country can use to actually channel into developing countries and actually monitor adaptation activities? So that's why we thought the mechanism and the structure that we have in place for our regular insurance for year-to-year risk, how can we scale that up in the context of adaptation? So I just wanted to give that clarification in terms of why we are also approaching this in this way. So what exactly is the extreme climate, what exactly is the Extreme Climate Index? It's a composite index based on existing rainfall and temperature indicators that are aggregated across time and space into one index. So we combine temperature, we look at, okay, what are the extremes? Can we track extremes in temperature, rainfall over this period, precipitation? Can we track the severity of these specific weather events in that region, as well as their frequency over a range of timescales and weather hazards? And an increase in ECI, or index, could potentially alert us to a change in the climate regime with respect to the frequency and intensity of extremes in the region. So this is how we've sought to approach this issue in terms of developing the Extreme Climate Index. This is a chart that we thought would be useful. It's a bit small, so I hope you might have to wink a bit. It shows an initial prototype of the ECI index for one of the regions. We've considered different weather hazards, so short-term seasonal dryness, short-term seasonal wetness, extreme heat, anomalously cold temperatures. And what we've observed is that it is clear there is significant variability in the regional ECI from month to month. So if you, I don't know if I can increase this. So this is actually looking at the period between 2010 and 2013. So within each year, you can see different types of, yes, for Ethiopia. Within this, you can see significant variability within a year. The first circle indicates a particular period of extreme dryness and heat, if you look at the black arrow. The second kind of bandwidth, you see that you have, we've just pointed out a specific period where you have wetness, but also quite hot period. And in the third band, you see a dry, cold sort of experience within that third band. So it just shows the variability that also exists. What we said is, can we set thresholds that will track when there is an extreme within this period, and use that as the basis for then triggering funds to support adaptation response in countries. Sorry. Okay. So in other words, this is a similar slide, but obviously with a much longer time series. We are showing payouts are triggered by changes in the frequency or in intensity of extreme events. So you have a lot of activity at the bottom, right? But you also have extremes occurring. So based on this data, can we then establish a threshold where if an event exceeds this particular threshold, we could then link that to some kind of payout, which would go to support government interventions on the ground. Sorry, I get confused by where I'm pointing to. Okay, yes. So we've seen a lot of charts now. What does this actually look like from an operational perspective? We take that information and we say, can we place this over a 30-year financing window where we can track these events every 5 years? And at the end of each 5 years, we have a threshold to say, okay, if the ECI was above this threshold, it would trigger financing to our governments. We measure or observe or monitor another 5-year bandwidth to say, okay, how has the climate performed? What are the extremes that we've observed within this band? Has it gone beyond a certain threshold? And then that would also be linked to payouts. I won't get into too much detail because I anticipate there will be lots of questions, and maybe that will allow us to go back and reflect on some of this. Okay, so this slide is actually to show how that would work. So you have the solid line, which is the actual multi-hazard extreme climate index. The broken line is the XCF payment trigger. So when you look at the first band, which is the first 5-year series, you will see that you have a multi-hazard climate index. The ECI doesn't actually hit the threshold which has been identified for that particular period. Within the second series, obviously, we have a number of events that allow us to go beyond that threshold. So at the end of that 5-year financing period, we then have a triggered payout to countries. That payout will then be used to support adaptation measures in our respective governments. And we monitor this over a period of 30 years, which are broken down into 5-year intervals, monitoring how the weather or climate is performing, the extremes that are occurring within that, and triggering payouts based on what we are observing. If we go back to the case in Niger, what we see, as Erica had pointed out, were that we had some extremes in 1973, extreme dry periods in 1973, 74, 83, 84, 87, which were which was essentially a period where we saw the cost of the premium really skyrocketing for our governments. But is there an opportunity with the ECI index in place? Some analysis that we undertook demonstrated that in that period, you could actually, or the ECI could potentially have triggered financing for governments to support adaptation measures. Obviously, this is not mutually exclusive from the premiums that the governments would pay to manage their year-on-year risk, because the idea is that donors would support the payment of the coupons to, for the structuring of the ECI mechanism. I don't know, Erica? Sorry. Okay. Okay. Sorry.
So, are you saying then that this would be a completely different financial structure from the ARC structure, in that it wouldn't be self-financed through premiums and existing funding? Okay.
So what we, and Erica will expand on this bit, is that what we are looking at is to assist those countries that are actually trying to manage their risk. So there's an eligibility criteria which we're currently trying to think through. All of this is under research and development within ARC right now, given the concerns that we've heard from our governments, to say, okay, those countries are actively trying to support better risk management, not only through securing insurance coverage through ARC, but also investments they're making in other activities, building the systems required, having discussions in governments, getting ministries of finance more engaged in sort of redirecting finance to better risk management measures, would then have the benefit of having this mechanism in place to support adaptation measures. It's a dialogue that is ongoing. We're having with our member states to see, okay, how would this work in reality when we start structuring these kinds of tools? Yes. Sorry. If you don't
mind. So I think I understand the approach that you're taking, but one thing that occurs to me is that the impact of any of these extreme events may really differ across the extreme events. I'm sure you've thought about this and maybe you're coming to it, but I'm just wondering, you know, let's say it's an extreme cold spell or something which is unusual, that might have a really different effect on, I don't know, cropping systems or something than lack of rainfall at the wrong time or extreme heat. And so would the payout be the same? Like the way you've shown it in the diagram, it's just for ease of communication, I think, but would it be kind of ranked according to those different risks in your little dial there?
So it's a composite index that takes into a number of extremes. So as I mentioned, we look at temperature, we look at precipitation to create a composite. And the payouts, so the payout question would be linked obviously to the composite, which is made up of these different different parameters. But the question on the adaptation side is then what kind of adaptation activities would we then implement in response to that? So one of the pieces of work that we now have to work through is looking at, okay, what are the adaptation options that are available and how do we prioritize them? Because once you have funds triggered, they have to go into these adaptation measures. We have to do a cost-benefit analysis probably of what the adaptation measures, what are the trade-offs in terms of selecting which ones will be eligible for financing under a potential structure like this. And we have a similar approach to our insurance contracts, where not all activities qualify for implementation under an ARC payout, in the sense that, okay, you have an event occur, the entire premise is based on early response. So we don't want an activity that's about investments or building some infrastructure 6 months down the road. We need something that can get to people immediately when they need assistance. On the adaptation front, it's a slightly different sort of question, which we are now trying to think through. What would that look like? We've had some support from the Climate Knowledge Development Network, as well as the Frankfurt School, to sort of help us, and also some continental institutions, so CSIR and others, to begin to help us to start to think through this, because it's a little bit, when we started off, we were looking at drought response, you know, obviously linked to climate, but it's now a different kind of exercise, and we need other partners who are involved in that space to guide us to say, okay, what is appropriate or what is not, and that's essentially where we are now. And I think Erica can expand on the, I think we're at this slide, which is how, on the financial mechanism itself, how we would seek to structure that. Oh yeah, sorry.
About how this whole is this working? How this all right, how the model works. Just picking up on this thing that we're talking about at the moment in terms of looking at it's kind of like encouraging or supporting countries to develop the infrastructure to be able to proactively deal with disasters effectively. Is there any thought around incentivizing that in any way, so where countries are able to demonstrate that they're being proactive, that could lead to low insurance costs or anything like that? In a similar way with health insurance, if you're a non-smoker, your premiums might be lower, those sorts of things. Is that something that's being looked at?
So every year in our process, we go through a customization, a review of the model, and a critical part of that is also tracking vulnerability in our countries, and that's an important component in defining what that risk looks like, which is then the basis for the contract. So that's one way in which you can sort of capture that. But we're also thinking, you're right, how do we make sure, how do we even accentuate a lot more the positive activities that governments might actually be taking in risk management? Internally, we've started to work with institutions like the African Development Bank, which do a lot of heavy investments on the continent around climate risk management, disaster management, etc., to say, okay, for those governments where we do have, and this is another reality we haven't necessarily touched on in this presentation, is that there's an interest, there's a demand for insurance coverage, but there is a challenge in terms of mobilizing premium to pay for this. Fiscal constraints, political issues, security issues. So making this a priority is not necessarily, you know, it's a challenge for government to pay the premium. And so one of the things that we've been discussing with the bank was, can the bank provide some kind of premium support? And it's not only the bank, there are other institutions as well, premium support for these governments that want to be proactive about managing their risk. And can we link that to some kind of measures to reduce their risk, right? So if you're going to get support for premium, you have to do certain things to actually reduce the underlying risk, right? And so that's part of the dialogue that we are encouraging and proactively pursuing in our countries, because for once we do have a mechanism where we can have a convergence in dialogue on risk management, not simply with the disaster management offices or the Ministry of Environment or Climate or Meteorological departments, but having the Ministry of Finance brought into that conversation about maybe alternative ways of planning and thinking about managing this risk. I don't know if Erica wants to add anything. Okay. But any other questions?
More a comment, and just to build on the good question, what I heard you say as a really nice answer is that this is a very positive trend toward actually trying to have a bit of a complement between the traditional development, sort of infrastructure development that a country might invest in, and kind of a separate discussion that seems to be happening, or that has been happening, with finance for climate adaptation or climate change mitigation. And I think what you're touching on is a way to actually bring those things together so that there's a mainstreaming, because if the ministries of finance get involved, then the projects that they're actually bankrolling with their own budgets are starting, you know, if one of the criteria is to actually, you know, have projects that are climate smart, then maybe that reduces the premium, it reduces the risk overall. And so, I don't know, just a comment. And I think there was a question in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Sheikh. Actually, I'm from Senegal. I was happy that this country is finally involved in this this kind of insurance because it's really needed in the Sahel in general. I'm leading the START International office here in Washington, D.C. I have two comments. One is about the index itself. The second one is about the mechanism to ensure applications of adaptation measures with communities. The index is well sought. Generally, using satellite data is a good issue, is a good data source for rainfall, actually for temperature. But if you try to detangle those parameters, temperature is more easily monitored and projected than rainfall. Rainfall has a very high variability, as we know from IPCC report and other studies. That makes me say some study we did in Burkina Faso, which clearly show that even for years where you have good rainfall, the interseasonal variation of rainfall can make it more risky than the total rainfall you receive in every year. That means the issue of dry spells is very important. At the time where crops needs real water, it stops raining. It's September. Those long dry spells are more frequent, and I can send you the paper we did on that. And that creates more difficulties for farmers to make sure that they harvest enough crop, despite the total rainfall, which is above average, as you can see in the last years of your studies. There was a challenge of doing the seasonal forecasting as well, to know what the next season looks like. And usually by the time we know how this season profile is, it's too late to intervene because adaptation needs to be planned. It's not only because you get the money or you get the insurance money that it's easily made. Overall, the poverty condition of the countries and the way policies implemented on the ground make it more stressful than the rainfall itself. So just to use an allegory here. The second thing is the issue of mitigation is easily manageable as compared to adaptation, because adaptation is fundamentally local. And in this process, I saw that you deal with governments, and government structure in West Africa, Francophone legacy, whatever, colonial legacy, is so bureaucratic. By the time the president decides, the minister has to decide, the governor has to decide, the chief of village, by the time you bring the response, it's too late. They all died or they all move. So this is a real issue, how to really convert those insurance to go straight to the community. When we was in COP, Marrakesh, and even Paris, we discussed that. GEF has put a lot of money to support adaptation, but the negotiation of adaptation should be directly paired with community requests, and the timely need of that money should be addressed much better. So I don't know what your general thought about those issues, which are real challenge I have seen in my real life.
It's a lot of questions, eh? And good feedback. I'm not a meteorologist, but I do recognize some of the issues that you have highlighted in terms of the importance of dry spells. It's not just deficiencies in rainfall, it's when that deficiency occurs, because it has an impact on the crops, right? And those are things that have emerged in the analysis that we're doing, and it's also why we've actually sought to engage scientific communities on the continent who are actively in this space to help us to see how can we refine this based on your understanding of how the climate functions on our continent, right? Right now, we're going through a process of reviewing the ECI Index, CSIR, SASCAL, WASCAL, ACMAD, Agrimet, and others to be involved in this, to really interrogate the work that we have done, because we need to have something that can stand up to the rigor that we needed to stand up to when we start taking this discussion to the finance front and to engagement with our countries, just because it's the responsible thing to do. On the question of adaptation, implementation, yes, it's always a challenge to say, okay, how do we ensure that resources get to people that have been affected? And I think that that's a really big contribution that we have made, or we've tried to make as an institution on that front, by saying that it's not, countries just don't access the insurance mechanism because it is there. There's a process that they have to go through. First process being to try and develop the risk profile and understanding of what drought looks like in my country. The second process is the contingency planning element that Erica had mentioned, which is you need to let us know as an institution, if you had a policy with ARC and it was triggered, how would you use those funds? What activities would you implement? And there's an entire stream of work that goes into saying, okay, all countries have contingency plans. There's a difference between contingency plans in paper and what that looks like in operation, right? And our job is to investigate that, to say, okay, what are the activities that actually can deliver to people on the ground? Can we monitor them? Can we observe them? Do they have a track record of delivering to these individuals? And then we have criteria which they have to match before they can even access the insurance mechanism. So oftentimes we say, okay, we have 32 countries that have signed the ARC Treaty and want to proceed with the technical work. But we've had 8 countries that have actually paid a premium to access insurance coverage. And part of that is, yes, the fiscal constraints, etc., but it is the technical work that has to go through to get them to a point where they can make an informed decision around the insurance contract, but also define how would I respond, right? And that's an important piece of work for us. There are other similar initiatives around the world, but none of them actually take it to that extra step of defining what contingency plans look like. On implementation and government systems and government bureaucracy, I hear you and I agree, but we are an AU institution. Governments are responsible for their citizens. We need to strengthen it. We acknowledge that we need to strengthen the public policy systems within our governments. The payouts that we have been through have also demonstrated key lessons to us as an institution. So for example, in Senegal, your country, where there was a payout of 16.5 million, one of the issues that we encountered was a bureaucratic and administrative one, given constraints that the government had in terms of fulfilling its obligations to other institutions. But when we think about disaster response, disaster risk management, and working with governments to track and improve these things, it's not necessarily the intuitive point that we go to in terms of why governments are not as responsive or as efficient in their activities. And I'm not saying that that is the only reason, right? There are many other reasons, but I'm just pointing out there are all these other dynamics when we talk about risk management, improving government systems. Because at the end of the day, we need to. I mean, there are other institutions that can play a role in this, international organizations, NGOs, etc. But we must also have governments that can function. And that's part of the responsibility of our institution.
One other thing that I want to say about that is that it's important to look at the two, even though we're giving the presentation together about all of what ARC does, it's important to think about them separately. So we have annualized seasonal insurance, right, which is what we're talking about, where we make the payout and it goes to the community, and they do the contingency planning ahead of time. And but those payouts, so for example in Senegal in 2014, they provided food assistance to 750,000 people through the government systems. But as Ekhosuehi pointed out, it maybe didn't work as fast as would have been ideal, which is one of our big lessons learned from those payouts, is how do you ensure that money funnels quickly through the financial systems. That's one thing. The Extreme Climate Facility is looking at, over a 5-year period, did the climate volatility change? So were there more volatile and more extreme weather events in that 5-year period? And that's the thing that we're continuing to do our research and development on, where we're trying to decide how would the adaptation plans work? What should the criteria be? And things like community involvement, it looks very, in some ways it can look very different, and we're trying to work with partners to ensure that we're working within the climate adaptation models that they're already going to be engaging in at the country level, so that we're not reinventing a different mechanism. We want to work with what they already have and potentially allow financing to reach adaptation projects that are already working on the community level, or through other organizations that are already working with this at the moment.
Thank you. Oh, never mind. I was just wondering, so you've got this fabulous system for tracking data, which is available to the member countries. Is it only available to member countries, or is it widely available and other organisations can buy into it and benefit from that and more effectively plan with governments and things like that?
So signing the ARC treaty, because ARC is a treaty organization, we have 32 member countries, automatically entitles a country to have access to Africa RiskView and to be trained to use it, etc. But we also have lots of other research institutions, humanitarian organizations. WFP, who we work with all the time, has ARV. Some of the partners, all the partners that Ekhosuehi mentioned, have access to ARV. So it's restricted in the sense that we're trying to protect our IP, and we don't want entities taking ARV and then selling commercial products necessarily. Not that we prevent that entirely either, but as a theoretical matter, we're protecting our intellectual property, but it's very available to other institutions that want to use it and have similar missions, and research institutions on the continent especially.
You mentioned that the payouts in 2014-2015 were 28-30 million between those 26, but so less than 10% of the total need that was requested through the standard donor channels. So those funds were directed specifically towards the immediate needs, or their contingency plans were focused on things that needed action in 4 months rather than 9 months later? And is it intended to scale, or is this going to be complementary going forward?
It's intended to be complementary. The $30 million, there's a couple of things that that create that number. I mean, again, it's different countries take out different amounts of insurance based on what they can afford because they're paying for it. And they have to have the capacity to actually implement the projects with the funding. So what happens is that the countries work together in our technical working groups that we convene within the country with the technicians at the government level. We also invite in humanitarian actors in the country to participate in the contingency planning, customization, and they work closely together because it is supposed to be complementary. It's never, well, not never. We don't intend at the moment for this to be a way for a country to finance an entire response to a drought that could cost $200, $300 million, $400 million. This is just to get them to be able to fund their own response so that they're taking control over some of the response rather than waiting for the international community response to come in. But they also work closely together with the humanitarian actors that are already there to make sure that there's not, that they're complementary to each other and that they can work together. So this is just to explain how the money is actually supposed to flow through the extreme climate facility. So as we've already explained, for ARC Insurance, the countries pay their own premium. They pay it into ARC Limited, which is the insurance company. ARC Limited then goes to the international markets and gets reinsurance to help the financial sustainability of the insurance company. XCF will work differently. And the idea is that for countries that are already managing their weather risk through ARC, they can take part in XCF. XCF will be its own entity that will enter into risk transfer contracts with the international risk and capital markets. So they're going to, once we know what countries are going to be participating and what level of risk we want to insure for them, we'll take all of that aggregate risk, which is done not on a national level but on a regional basis, because climate change impacts would be regional, and transfer that risk to the capital markets through insurance or derivatives or potentially catastrophe bonds. The cost of transferring that risk would be paid by the donors. So this is a way to get donor funding for adaptation channeled and also capitalize on the risk appetite of the markets, because there is an appetite for African risk in the international risk and capital markets. So the donors will be paying for it, and then if at the end of the 5-year period the ECI triggers indicating that there has been a change in the climate, then whatever instrument we've used to go to the markets will trigger, and the payment will be made to the countries through XCF.
Thank you. Sorry, David Bernardo from PACT. So if you go back to that slide, this only works as long as the donors provide that sort of de-risking element. Is that essentially what that is? And so without that, this could not work. Am I correct in saying this? And so in the case of, if for example, then if donors' priorities change, take example of USAID and US government, then this essentially would not work in the way it is planned now.
Yes, essentially, because the idea of this is that we don't want to pass this cost on to our member states, because right now the member states pay for their weather insurance, but what we're looking for is a way to fund their adaptation in an objective, measurable way, but we don't want to pass this cost on to our member states who are already taking on a significant burden. So yes, I think if the donor's priorities change, this will have a significant impact on this project, for sure.
would it be possible, instead of having donors cover that cost because of the point just made, to have private sector cover that? Is that even a possibility?
Well, the private sector is taking on the risk. But it's a good. It could be reinsurance or catastrophe bonds, etc. It's an interesting question. I actually never, I actually never thought in terms of private sector, because we've always approached this from, okay, the donors covering this as a means to fund adaptation using an objective sort of measure to monitor shifts in climate, and you have ready adaptation plans, activities, you channel it. So we've thought about the donor. We've also thought about the Green Climate Fund, which expressed a keen interest in this, not so much on the year-to-year insurance contract, but this because it's directly linked to the mandate of the Green Climate Fund. But on the question of private sector, I have to admit I haven't thought about that. So we will have to reflect on that as an institution and try and get back to you.
The way I'm interpreting it is that the Extreme Climate Fund, it's a way to help inform donors' strategic investments in particular countries with respect to climate change adaptation. More than it's not an insurance product in any way, shape, or form. It's an index that allows donors to contribute on some evidence-based mechanism. Is that?
Yes, 100% accurate, I think. You're absolutely right, because we, as an institution, the mandate to actually work on this came from the Ministers of Finance. And it was based on the acknowledgement that you have a lot of discussion around climate finance, around resources available, but real difficulty in terms of saying, okay, how access to these funds. And so the idea was, could we develop something that's data-driven, objective, that there could be consensus around between donor community, countries on this issue, and with adaptation plans that we can all agree on beforehand, what this would look like. And so that is really where this idea has come from. It's not necessarily driven by, okay, the markets in that sense. It's leveraging the markets to access capital, and leveraging donor resources to access greater capital to support adaptation in countries. That's what it is, right? Yes.
So the question is, are there any accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that governments are using the payout to actually respond to the extreme event?
Yes. So the way that works is that, again, the countries have pre-approved contingency plans before they even take out the insurance. Then right before there's a payout, they do this final implementation plan that goes through a similar, the same actually, approval process. It goes through a technical review, it goes through something called the peer review mechanism, and then it goes to the board for approval. Then we take that and we have an entire M&E work stream. We have process auditing, we have financial auditing. The country has to provide reporting, final reports, regular reporting, and besides that, all of those formal mechanisms for monitoring what's happening with the payout. We also have very frequent communication between our staff and the staff on the government staff on the ground, with whom, by this point, by the time they get a payout, we will have been working with the same people for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. So we have very good working relationships with them, and they talk frequently. You know, our contingency planning officers, the country engagement staff, with the government coordinator that's employed by the government, they're speaking to each other very frequently. And we have, if it seems that something, they also have the opportunity to change their plan. So if something happens on the ground that changes the dynamic, they can request a change. That also has to go through the board. So they have the opportunity to make changes. We're not trying to catch them doing something wrong. But if there's something that doesn't seem to be going right, the board has the ability to intervene in the middle of a payout to, you know, communicate at the higher levels of the government or deploy additional resources for monitoring on the ground. If we go through these various processes and there's still an issue, there's actually a process post payout to look backwards and if something goes wrong and sort of assess an appropriate response that ranges from saying, you know, in future you'll have to have additional monitoring because there were these issues, all the way to if there's a gross misappropriation, intentional misappropriation of funds, there's a mechanism for asking for the money back and suspending a country from ARC. And we hope to never have to use any of these mechanisms, but they're all in place, and they're, again, this is a work in progress. So we learned lessons from our previous, you know, payouts about how easy or difficult it is to do financial auditing of a government, and that causes us to change our processes over time to make it sort of more realistic in terms of what's actually possible, as well as more effective and more, you know, continuous engagement with the governments. Because we've found through this process that the most important thing that we can do is engage really intensively with our countries, because the more buy-in we have from the technical working group, the more of a clear understanding of what's going, you know, how the products work we have with our government counterparts, the more effective we can be, and the better the implementations are, and, you know, the more likely they are to continue to take out insurance. So I think we've more or less covered everything on this slide, unless you had something else. Oh.
Is this going to be expanded into further infrastructure? Because, you know, like electrical grid or anything.
I don't think so. Our objective right now is to preserve lives and livelihoods and the most vulnerable populations. We expressly don't allow countries to insure infrastructure, but that said, we started off working with some of the countries with the highest drought risk, but we're also moving into flooding and tropical cyclone, and that changes the dynamics a little, and we have a, you know, a wider range of countries now who have more needs that they would like us to address. So it's not, I don't think it's out of the question, but it's not something that we're looking at right at the moment.
I showed up a few minutes late, so I apologize if this was covered, but I was wondering, member states, are they all part of the ARC insurance scheme, or is it just that they can be? And you know, are they pledged to make to pay the premiums? And in either case, those states that are part of this process where they are paying the premiums, has that been an issue, defaults, etc.?
When we say we have 32 member states, we mean the agency has 32 countries that have signed the treaty. In most cases, that's because they want to take out insurance. We don't necessarily have the capacity at the moment to engage with all of them, so we're going little by little. As Ekhosuehi pointed out, 8 countries have now taken out insurance from the insurance company. In order to do that, we enter into an MOU with them that lays out the program in terms of customizing the software, coming up with the contingency plans, etc. And then once they get to the end of that process, then they make a decision about whether they want to take out insurance or not. So we've had countries that have gone all the way through the process and have decided, for a variety of reasons, some of them financial, actually almost entirely financial, that they're not going to take out insurance at the end of the process. So nearly all the 32 would like to. Some of them, though, joined with the intention of using a future product. So because they're more interested in flood, they haven't engaged with us fully yet, because we're right now, our active product is drought, and we expect a number of new countries to engage and are already engaging with them in the pilot program to take out flood insurance. So it's a mix. So we've actually got 2 sets of members. We've got our agency members, which are countries that have signed the treaty, and we have our limited members, which are the ones that have actually taken out insurance.
Yes, to your question on premium payment issues, so far we have had all the countries that have participated in ARC, 95%, I think, have paid premium out of national budgets. That's really significant, I think, because it says that there is an ownership to some extent, an understanding of what the liabilities are, the risks that they're faced with. In our first year, we collected 17 million. Second year, 26.5 million. So there's that understanding. Once I think there's an engagement, and especially, as I said, bringing the group decision makers around the table to be engaged on this. But we have faced challenges because insurance is also something, and these new tools and instruments that we have, it also requires a lot of effort to engage with our governments around building understanding of these mechanisms. So we talk about insurance and then we add on its parametric insurance. That requires also building capacity and working with our governments to understand what that really looks like, and then what makes sense in terms of a contract structuring perspective. We also have a situation where you have countries that have participated for a number of years and there is no payout, right? And that can be quite testing for governments that has other priorities. And so that's part of the challenge that we face in terms of growing the pool, is that insurance is not something that you enter into on an ad hoc basis. It's a consistent policy, right? It's a risk management strategy, one of a number of tools that the government should be seeking to employ. And so that's why we've started to work with institutions like the African Development Bank to say, okay, how do we give our countries time to actually build this into their budgeting process, right? Because right now on a year-to-year basis, it's like, okay, pay your premium, next year it's due again. And we're looking at a number of interesting models. Can you also structure contracts for maybe 3 years so that you're not going back every year to ask the government for a premium, but you have 3 years, you pay, you move like that. And so we're actively working on it. Is a challenge. I can't sit here and say that it isn't. It's part of why we are seeing difficulties in growing the pool. And we're hoping. The interesting point I wanted to mention is that, as I mentioned, there are other initiatives around the world, right? And there's been a lot of support to allow those governments to build premium support in the initial stages, right? To build this into their budget. So for example, in the Caribbean, a lot of those countries receive support from the World Bank and other donors. First couple of years, you support it with 100%, 75%, a digressive sort of premium subsidy. In the African context, we actually didn't have that. So from the start, these governments were financing premium from their budget. And this is taking place in parallel with a technical directorate that we need to work with to build understanding, but also a political directorate that might not necessarily be as plugged into insurance. So it's a challenging environment to be working in, but we have seen some commitments to some extent, and it's how do we keep that momentum going.
Hi, my name is Sarah Casey. I'm from Tetra Tech. My question, I really have 2 questions, so I'm going to limit it today. Your household data for establishing vulnerability, are you guys gathering that data? Are you depending on the government, or do you have like another partner?
It depends on the context. Sometimes it's government data, sometimes it's data from international institutions, so WFP, UNICEF, others. We have to actually actively go into discussions with these countries to try and get access to this data, which we use to inform the vulnerability. But it also speaks to a much wider issue on, and it's, again, conversations that we have with other institutions that are working with this space, is that data is important. More data, better data that we have, better instruments we can create, better tools, better decision-making tools that can inform better planning in our governments. And so that's part of what we are trying to do, is we do not operate ARC as selling an insurance mechanism to a government, but how does this insurance mechanism sit in a broader strategy for the government, and what are the opportunities to actually leverage that for a much deeper delve into the investments that we're making. And insurance could be one, but there are also a lot of other things that we need to be thinking about. And our governments are thinking about that. And yeah, we're working on it.
My second question is, you said you're allowing each government to determine their per person response cost. I can guess why you do it that way, but I also am curious how different governments have approached determining that.
The response cost is based on the activities that the government would want to implement in the event of a disaster, right? So that's part of what factors into determining the response cost. I don't know if there's any more to add towards that. We didn't actually elaborate much on how we do the risk profiling work, because you are right. That is what we ensure. It's the government's response cost. And so a lot of the contingency planning work, customization work is actually critical in actually coming up with that historical response cost series. Unfortunately, neither Erica or I are in the contingency planning team, but essentially it is a conversation with the government. You're trying to determine what is the cost of responding to people using specific activities and for how long. Okay? These are some of the factors that we consider. Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned that the ECI threshold events were based primarily on historical meteorological data, or that's how you're determining where the thresholds are. But for a number of West African countries in particular, there's very poor historical climate data to work from. How do you build that into your model?
What about the future?
Yes.
Go back to the time series one. So for the indices that we use, we have at least 30 years of data for all of our countries. For some countries, a lot more. So like the satellite-based rainfall data is from NOAA, and what was that? Yeah. In some cases, we have more data, just depending. And so what we're looking at I just want to go back to this one because it shows you the future. We're talking about a 5-year window, but we're actually comparing 30 years in 5-year increments. So the idea is that we need the 30 years of data. That's how we came with the 30 years, because we had it most reliably. And so you're comparing this 30 years with a 30-year period 5 years later, which is how we're trying to take into account what's changed from the historical record. So if we had a consistent historical record for 30 years, which of course it's not completely consistent, but then that by shifting the 30 years by 5 years, you can see if statistically that 5-year period looks different in terms of volatility or extremes than the previous 30-year period would have looked. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's we do have, like I said, 30 years of data and the indices that we're using, which is not true in every case, in every type of hazard that you would want to look at.
You're not building in sort of forecasts for mid-century or end of century or anything like that?
No, there's no forecasting in this. It's actually looking at what's already happened.
So say you get a donor to support the ECF or XCF. Would it have to be at a national level? Could it be at a subnational or say a municipal level if that's where there were funds were dedicated to could just work with the city and not just the whole country?
Actually, the XCF triggers regionally, not nationally. And this is one of the things that we have to think about in the R&D phase is how are we going to allow donors to, they're paying for the risk to be transferred to the market of the entire pool. Are we going to make it so that donors can pick a country or not? I think we would in some ways be inclined to say not, right? Because if you want to facilitate climate adaptation funds for Africa, parsing it out country by country sort of defeats the purpose of the way that the index works. But that's not a 100% decision at the moment. It's something that we're working through. But I don't think we certainly don't think we would go to a smaller than national basis.
I was also thinking on the same direction because adaptation can be what you meant, like an extreme event. It can be also an action for long term. It can be something which is requiring actions for 5 years. And investing into 5 years adaptation require a substantive capital that always cannot come from the government. We work with local banks or local financial institutions to sort of share the risk with funders. What's the mechanism if an adaptation is, for instance, to to adapt a new crop to a landscape to create food security, for instance. Not just extreme events right now, something which needs to be projected for the 5 years to come, which is real adaptation. Because this one is coping, just responding to something immediately difficult.
Actually, the weather insurance is responding to an event that's just happened. The 5-year XCF window is not related to a particular event. It's 5 years and that's it. And the idea is that at the end of that climate period, you would be using the, you assume the climate is going to change, but you don't know how, right? So the idea is that to trigger after that 5-year period, when you know what has actually happened, then that is actual adaptation funding that they're supposed to apply to longer term projects. It's not, the idea is not that there will be an event and there will be a payout. It's the 5-year window. The event could occur in year 2. That is what pushes you up and says this is such an extreme that will say that the climate has changed based on this event. It's probably not going to be one event. It's probably going to be a series of more extreme, more frequent, more volatile events that show you that in that 5-year period the climate has changed. And the idea of the adaptation funds is real adaptation funds in the sense that now the government knows that there's been a change and can look at the data to say what kind of change it's been and use that money to fund changes in crops or other kind of adaptation mechanisms that are long-term, but they're not using the money to respond to an event. That's what the insurance is for.
Well, just to pick up on the point that to pick up on your point earlier, that the visibility, so knowing that at the end of the 5 years that they can expect to have, this investment or this funding come, they could actually already start planning during that 5-year window before the money even comes, which is actually very nice.
We're actually having this discussion that we could have scenarios where you could, say, even release a portion of the funds earlier, before the end of the 5-year window, to support, even earlier action. And so those are the kinds of things that we're thinking of. How do you really make that possible in our government's management? Why these meetings are important for us as well, because this is actually the first, I think, an early point in sharing more detail around some of the challenges around thinking and some of the interesting things that have emerged in our work so far.
It's certainly the first time we've had an interaction like this with people. We've briefed our governments on this. We've had very intensive conversations with them about the government, about their role, their priorities, their concerns about this, but we actually haven't had other uninvolved experts come to talk about. So it is really helpful to talk about how this is going to play out because it's still in development phase.
I have 4 little questions that are just clarification, but if there are others on the phone, then. So you probably said this at the beginning and I just didn't hear it, but African Risk Capacity, are you guys an NGO? Are you a private sector organization? You said it's a treaty, so that's confusing. So
I'm the lawyer. So it's an intergovernmental organization. So it's founded by the governments themselves who signed the treaty to establish the organization. So we're a specialized agency of the African Union, but we're not, specialized agencies of the African Union are independent. So we're self-funded, we're self-governed, we're sort of under the umbrella of the African Union, but it's like any other, UN-ish treaty organization where it's formed by the governments themselves.
I don't know anything about insurance other than I pay premiums. What is parametric insurance? What does that mean? And speaking to the point that I think you had, Erica, about the fact that because of increasing volatility, premiums are going up, the countries can't actually afford it in the future. But some countries are paying the premiums and they're not actually getting payouts because maybe they're not experiencing extreme events. So how is the analysis of risk actually changing the premiums that different countries pay? So I don't know if that was clear. And then I think I heard you say that DFID and KfW are provided the initial capital. Is that likely to continue, or is it even necessary if the countries are paying premiums? I'll stop there.
Parametric insurance. It's a type of insurance where you have predefined triggers, objective triggers, predefined triggers that you can use to link to a payout. So I'll give you an example. Traditional indemnity insurance, you have to go out, when a loss occurs, you have to go out into the field, send loss adjusters, determine what that loss is, and then they come back and they give you an estimate of what the loss estimate is associated with that damage. With parametric insurance, beforehand you agree with the client, if this is to be met, this level of damage is to be met, we expect the corresponding amount of payouts associated with this damage. So it's predefined beforehand. So we can say, in the case of drought, in a particular country, we agree with the government that if 1.2 million people are affected by this drought event, we expect that the policy will trigger a corresponding payout. So that's what parametric insurance essentially is, which means that you also require a lot of upfront data to inform what that risk looks like, and a lot of work with the government to understand this issue as well, right? Parametric insurance is also, I think, gaining a lot of popularity because with the traditional indemnity, there's a cost associated with going out into the fields, determining what the loss is, all of that, which factors into the premium. With parametric, you don't necessarily have that. You can determine the loss as soon as it hits certain thresholds. It also means that you can trigger payouts quite quickly because you're not waiting for loss assessments to take place, which is really where the value comes in for governments, etc. The second question, the other question you had was on deferred capital. Yes, deferred capital has contributed capital, but the premium that the government actually pay, a portion of that is actually goes towards repayment of that loan. Well, for 20 years.
So they gave ARC Limited. ARC Agency is funded by donors, like most IO's donations, straight up. ARC Limited, when you found an insurance company, there are capital requirements so that you can't say you're going to provide insurance and then you have a bunch of claims and then you don't have the money to pay for it, right? So we're regulated under the laws of Bermuda. There's a capital requirement, and that's the seed kind of money that DFID and KFW have contributed, but it's a 20-year returnable fund. So there's no interest, but after 20 years, you're supposed to give it back, which is why Ekhosuehi said that there's a percentage of the premium that goes to replenishment of the capital, because what we're trying to do is build up the African government's capital so that it's sufficient to support the insurance company on its own, and then we will pay back in 20 years the money that KFW and DFID have lent us, essentially.
Sorry, I was going to wrap things up, but if you, yeah? Okay. Yeah, what I was going to say is, to the extent that you all are willing to stick around for a few minutes, everyone's welcome to stay and ask more questions, talk among yourselves. There are some soft drinks and some cookies, many of which I see are still sitting there, which are available if anyone would like to have them. So I thank everyone for coming. Just as a reminder, the next monthly meeting will be on May 18th here again, and the subject will be the Coastal City Adaptation Project, which is a USAID-funded project in Mozambique, and the chief of party for that project will be here to make the presentation. One final point, after each of these events, for those who don't know, we do upload the slides, and the actual recording will also be available, and both are available at climatelinks.org. And if you can't find it quickly when you get to the site, just put something in the search engine. You should be able to get to where it is. So again, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.